Thank you for coming out. Can you hear me okay without the microphone? All right, so I will show you the book that's coming out. Let's see, I put it in events because I am saying it's going to be a book release party. So here's the book. It's called Retrieving Knowledge, A Socratic Response to Skepticism. And if you were at my last talk, it was about Socrates and the Sophists. So that's the early part of the book. The latter part of the book is about Nietzsche and the Post-Nietzschian philosophers that I'm calling the Post-Nietzschian nihilism. That's only part of the story. If you go to the home page, retphi.com, and you look at this image, I want to draw your attention to the image. This is from Plato's allegory of the line, which goes with the allegory of the cave. And if you notice, there's this order, ascending order from imagining to belief to thinking to knowing. And part of our story tonight is going to be about life on the bottom half of the line, or the correspondence to the cave, if you remember the allegory of the cave, if you're in my class. Okay, so the outline begins, let me click on if you click on this, my talk, you will get an outline. And I'll project it, but I may space out and forget to move things, so let's move that out of the way. There we go. So we have some quotes. I don't know why, but I've gotten into this pattern of starting with quotes and having an outline. It keeps me organized, otherwise I'll just talk. So let's read through the quotes and see how these are relevant to the talk. So this begins, reason in language. Oh, what an old deceptive female she is. I'm afraid we are not rid of God because we still have faith in grammar. This is a quote from Nietzsche, and it really struck me. It's one of the reasons why I started studying him. I'm like, what is this connection between reason, God, and grammar? Because he thinks we need to break this up. So I'm still thinking about this connection. The next quote is also by Nietzsche, and I'll just read it. It could be possible that whatever gives value to those good and honorable things has an incriminating link, bond, or tie to the very things that look like they're evil opposites. Perhaps they are even essentially the same. Perhaps. But who is willing to take the charge of such a dangerous perhaps? For this, we must await the arrival of a new breed of philosophers, ones whose taste and inclination are somehow the reverse of those we have seen so far. Philosophers of the dangerous, perhaps, in every sense. And in all seriousness, I see these new philosophers approaching. So these are the philosophers that are going to be doing the opposite of what has gone on prior to Nietzsche. And then the last quote is by Charles Taylor. This is going to be my cliffhanger for the talk at GCC. Taylor's talking about what he calls the immanent frame. He says, the power of materialism today comes not from the scientific facts, but is rather to be explained in terms of the power of a certain package uniting materialism with a moral outlook. The package we could call atheist humanism or exclusive humanism. What gives the package its power? I've been trying to answer this above in terms of certain values which are implicit in the immanent frame, such as disengaged reason, which, pushed to the limit, generate the science-driven death of God story. All right, so this is what Taylor writes this huge book about secularism, or the story of secularization. So what's the link between these quotes? So reason, God, and grammar are linked by Nietzsche. These new philosophers of the future are going to unlink those. And when you unlink those, you have the immanent frame. That's my claim. So let me give you my thesis statement. I love to give a thesis statement. This is my argument, and I welcome critique. I welcome pushback. I often pay money for critique. Ask my students, right? Or points. I'll give you points. All right, so here's my thesis. Martin Heidegger, in his essay, The Word of Nietzsche and the Death of God, and I made a link there so you could read it later, says that the result of Nietzsche's claim that God is dead and the subsequent revaluation of values results in both negative nihilism and positive nihilism. Negative nihilism is anti-reason, anti-foundationalist, anti-metaphysics, anti-objective morality. Positive nihilism is the willing out beyond the individual self to greater society, the new values that replace the old. My thesis is that historically, negative nihilism is carried out by postmodern deconstruction, and that positive nihilism is carried out by means of pragmatism and cultural neo-Marxism. Deconstruction, pragmatism, and cultural neo-Marxism are not identical, but they share a family resemblance of assumptions that provide an alternative worldview to the Platonic Christian hegemony of the pre-Nietzschean philosophy. Those are Heidegger's words, not mine. Post-Nietzschian nihilism is life within Plato's cave. It is the immanent frame. It is the lower half of the line in Plato's allegory of the line. All right, so that's my claim. You get to test it, see if it's watertight. Let's see what you think. All right, so now I have an outline. You can follow it. I'll move this up. You can follow along if you have your device, or you can watch up here. So the first part, we want to talk about Nietzsche and the metaphysics of his day and his claim that God is dead. What does this mean, the death of God? Nietzsche, I made a link there too. I like to put in lots of more information so you could do more digging. So this is an interactive outline. Nietzsche is a German philologist at first, and a philologist is a lover of the logos, which is kind of ironic because of where he turns out later as an anti-logos philosopher. So he's a German philologist and a philosopher at the end of the modern period. I'm going to say he's at the tail end of the modern period. He lives from 1844 to 1900. Now, he has this idea that all of philosophy from his day, from Plato's day to his day, has gone badly wrong. It's off course, and he needs to redirect it. He calls this philosophizing with a hammer. The main thing I focused on in my book, particularly chapter 3, is his rejection of this idea that reason is ontological, that reason applies to being. He's going to say the law of non-contradiction is not something we can apply to the world. It's just a tool for logic. And I'm going to suggest that divorce of reason from being is what breaks philosophy. Because the first philosophers, their goal was to understand why our minds fit the world. This is what I called the search for the logos. The first philosophers were trying to search for that explanation for the fit between thinking and being, and Nietzsche breaks that. That's my argument. He thinks that reason is a fiction that we have created, and then we have forgotten that we have created it. And reason is a tool that's useful for ordering the flux that is our experience. Now, he thinks that all is matter, and matter is constantly in motion, and so we need to create order, and that's the tool of reason is used for that. But also reason is an exercise of power that some philosophers have used to control people. So Plato particularly, maybe Aristotle. So reason is a tool to control others. He doesn't like that. The metaphysics of his day is something that he indirectly addresses in the Madman quote. Now, the last time I was at ASU and gave a talk, I did a kind of analysis of the Madman quote. So I'm not going to go over it again, but there's a link there. You can skim it. I'll summarize it. But the Madman is in Thus Spake Zarathustra, and it involves Zarathustra coming into a group of freethinkers in the marketplace who are standing around, and he says, have you heard, God is dead? And they start laughing at him. And he's like, why are you laughing? Have you not heard? And they kind of mock, and he goes into this sort of soliloquy about how the earth has been unhinged from the sun, And in the end, he's in the churches mourning the death of God. So in this quote, he first addresses the atheists. And it seems as though he's addressing their assumptions insofar as they haven't gone far enough. Then he addresses the religious people and probably their fideism. So the next section, in section D here, this is something that he has done repeatedly in his works. He is going to call out the philosophers of the modern period on their moderate empiricism. Now, moderate empiricism is something like all of our knowledge is through the senses, and our senses are somehow in touch with the world so that the world delivers knowledge. He's going to say, no, that's not true, because if all is in flux, everything's in motion, including you. You're part of that natural world. You are part of the flux and the flow. There's no permanent being, and there's no permanent knower. So he's pushing these free thinkers and atheists of his day to go farther in their empiricism. And the next point I have here is their moderate materialism. So they're materialists. They think that all that exists is matter and nature, but they're still realists insofar as they think the material world is real, and so our senses are in contact with reality. He's going to blow that apart and say, no, matter is, again, in flux. It's a kind of anti-realism, and that'll be a theme that comes up a lot tonight. And then he, by implication, is going to address the moderate skepticism, maybe the skepticism like Hume, David Hume, where he's going to say, well, we can't really know things like causation because we can't observe it. We don't know for sure if the sun is going to rise tomorrow. It's something we're assuming on past experience. But I argued with Dr. Anderson about this during my dissertation, that I think Nietzsche's a little more extreme in his skepticism. But that's open for discussion. And then lastly, this slave morality. He is going to criticize probably these free thinkers in the marketplace for giving up their belief in God but holding on to the morality of their rejected religion. And so this slave morality is something he talks about and is connected to Christian morals, and he thinks this is something we need to throw off. And these free thinkers of his day are still holding on to some kind of objective morality. And that's something he's going to push to the limits and critique. And that's part of what I'm going to focus on tonight. All right, so nihilism means nothing. I mean, that's what the word means. Nihilism is nothing. And it's often understood as meaninglessness. Now, it's true that he is concerned about this meaninglessness, Nietzsche is, but part of the nihilism is when these philosophers of his day hold on to the old values, but they deny the metaphysical root that they once had in God. So holding on to morals without God or the metaphysical grounding is where there's something meaningless. There's no rational justification for those morals. Or I put here, there's no moral absolutes without God. So he sees that, and he sees their morality as a kind of a meaningless position. And he has, this is a quote from Nietzsche, nihilism is the inner logic of Western history. I like that he sees this inner logic. Why? We might want to ask why later on. Now, he has a quote about these philosophers of the dangerous perhaps. These are the philosophers of the future. He has other quotes where he talks about these philosophers of the future, and he sees them coming. I'm going to argue that the philosophers he's talking about are those who will carry out his project. And he does have a project. Even if he says something about nihilism, there's a positive aspect to his nihilism that is a project. Now, I am going to use Martin Heidegger as a conversation partner to get into what this nihilism means. And I think I made a link to it earlier. Heidegger's essay, The Word of Nietzsche and the Death of God, This is in Heidegger's collected essays on technology. I made a link to it. And Heidegger is a German philosopher who is coming, he's like 11 years old when Nietzsche dies. He is going to be one of the first persons to recognize Nietzsche as someone important and to promote his works. He writes 4 volumes on Nietzsche and interpreting Nietzsche. Now, I'm not sure to what extent Heidegger agrees with Nietzsche, but he does pick up a lot of his themes and carries them forward. And one of the major themes in these collected works is this idea of nihilism. But I used the essay as an entryway. And so some of the things I'm going to use next are some quotes from that essay, The Word of Nietzsche. So here's one of the quotes. The pronouncement God is dead means the suprasensory world is without effective power. It bestows no life. Metaphysics, that is for Nietzsche, Western philosophy understood as Platonism, is at an end. Nietzsche understands his own philosophy as the counter-movement to metaphysics, and that means for him a movement in opposition to Platonism. All right, so some of the important pieces to look at here is this idea of a suprasensory world. Suprasensory is anything transcendent. So that's going to come out, and that's going to be one of the themes of the post-Nietzschian philosophers. Second quote from Heidegger. Metaphysics is history's open space, wherein it becomes a destining, one of those Heidegger words, that the suprasensory world, the ideas, God, the moral law, the authority of reason, progress, the happiness of the greatest number, culture, civilization, suffer the loss of their constructive force and become void. Notice that they lose their constructive force. This is the idea of deconstruction later on. So all of these things are going to be turned over by these new philosophers of the future. You guys like these things, the ideas, Plato's ideas, the God, the moral law, the authority of reason? Notice the happiness of the greatest number. Is this a dig at Marx or the utilitarians? All right, so what does Heidegger mean? He literally means the death of God is the death of the Christian God. Let me put this up a little bit. The death of the Christian God. And it's the end of the suprasensory world. I like that he picks that word, suprasensory, not supernatural, suprasensory. So it's above the senses, above the sensations. So sensory world is the only world down here. That's from Heidegger. And this is the cave. This is the world unloosed from the sun in that madman quote. And the sun in Plato's cave is like the good. So this is the world loosed from the good and from the transcendent reality. And the suprasensory world is also equated with the metaphysical world. So I think this is like a philosophical sleight of hand, where they say the suprasensory world is metaphysics. There is no suprasensory world, so we don't do metaphysics anymore. And that's the move of these post-Nietzschean philosophers. Suprasensory, metaphysics. No more suprasensory, therefore no more metaphysics. He says that God is dead means that we are straying through an infinite nothing. There's just us flung out into the universe, right? That's kind of nice. Dark. So nihilism, he says, is the highest values revaluing themselves. I'm not sure what that means, but you have these highest values, the good, the moral law, and now they're turning on themselves. And the devaluing the highest values up to now includes the true, the good, and the beautiful. All the things that philosophers were deeply interested in are now turning on themselves. All right. He also says that nihilism is the unconditional counter-movement to devaluing by willing out beyond the ideal of superabundant life. Okay, what does that mean? That's like Heidegger jargon. It means that, and he says this explicitly, the talk about values originates with Nietzsche. There were no values talk before Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is going to suggest that part of nihilism is that you will out beyond yourself, you will to power out beyond yourself new values. These are values that are going to fill the place of the old values. And notice it's a willing, and it includes power. So it's not going to be like, hey, let's argue like philosophers of the past and try to figure out what the good is. It's going to require somebody, somewhere, to push it out onto society. And I'm going to suggest that that's part of what these post-Nietzschean philosophers are going to do. All right, remember, if you have questions, write them down. Now, some of the family resemblances of the post-Nietzschean philosophers. Now, I'm going to suggest, actually I don't suggest, I argue it pretty vigorously in my book, that the post-Nietzschean philosophers include contemporary continental philosophers, French and German philosophers, analytic British and American analytic philosophers, and American pragmatist philosophers. All three strains have these family resemblances in general. Not every single philosopher, but in general, these are the family resemblances in each of these strains, okay? They're anti-enlightenment. This is part of postmodernism, right? Postmodern, post-enlightenment. And I put some of the values of the Enlightenment there just to kind of, help you remember what enlightenment might include. Individualism, reason, the emphasis on reason and science, the moderate empiricism, autonomy of the individual, freedom, progress. So these are the things that are going to come under critique in this post-Nietzschean nihilistic era. So they also are anti-reason, and I'm wondering, are they really anti-reason or are they anti-rationalism? Is this critique of the transcendent stuff a critique of rationalism? We'll have to figure that out as we discuss later. But they agree that reason does not apply to being. They might uphold logic as a tool, but logic doesn't tell us anything about reality. They are pretty much, to a thinker, anti-foundationalism. I don't know if you've heard this in your studies, but there are no foundations to beliefs. There are no basic beliefs that structure the rest of belief. And I think they're probably critiquing something like Descartes in his cogito, like I think, therefore I am, and from there I can reason out from myself to everything else. We could discuss that a little bit more too. They are anti-metaphysics. Like I said, they think of metaphysics as the supranatural. So the opposite of that is all that exists is the natural or the sensory. Part of what goes with that is, and the flux doctrine is is anti-realism. There's no reality outside of our interpretation. There's no view from nowhere, as Richard Rorty will say. All is interpretation. I'm sure you've heard this, right? All is interpretation. They're anti-objective values. There's no good for all humans based on human nature because there's no permanent natures of things. And then it's anti-Christian. And I'm open to pushback on any of these. All right, so that's the family resemblances, and I'm going to suggest that they come out in different ways through different groups. So the next thing I want to talk about is post-Nietzschean negative nihilism. All right, so the negative nihilism is rooting out all those old values of the pre-Nietzschean era. So wherever you see vestiges of moderate empiricism or moderate materialism or this idea that your mind fits reality and we can understand being, objective moral values, that's what we need to root out. So the negative nihilism comes through criticism, and it could be going all the way back to Kant with his critiques. That becomes a tradition, critique. And deconstruction. So we were talking about the constructed values. We have to deconstruct those old values. So deconstruction comes through Jacques Derrida And he's going to, in his philosophical moves, argue against what he calls presence. Presence is like being with a nature. He's going to argue against the transcendental signifier and the transcendental signified. So our words we think our words apply to being, but our words are only applying to other words. So there's a play of language or language games, but language doesn't touch reality. He's against what's called logocentrism. And I've had a back and forth with a person over this recently, and I felt like we were missing each other, because I read Derrida, and I see him attacking what he calls the word, capital W. Logos is the word, or the word of God, and Nietzsche wants to deconstruct that. But a colleague was arguing with me that no, Nietzsche is really arguing against the primacy of the spoken word for the other of the written word. Okay, that's partly there, but I think that is not the philosophical argument. That may be a literary part of Derrida. So if you click on the deconstruction link, and there's a nice article there, and it will show you the difference between how Nietzsche's philosophy is applied to how literary theory and Nietzsche's contribution to literature is applied. And I think that's a nice distinction to keep in mind in this discussion. I'm not talking about the literature that Derrida is deconstructing. I'm talking about his philosophical assumptions that he inherits from Nietzsche. Okay, we could talk more about this. The other negative nihilism is in this act of genealogy. Nietzsche kind of originates genealogy, and genealogy is a historicism, a radical historicism that seeks to uncover power dynamics. It unmasks power dynamics, and it comes out in things like knowledge power. Like there is no knowledge; it's just a power struggle. And this is a kind of radical historicism that Michel Foucault picks up on and develops. So that's another aspect of negative nihilism. And then I put critique here. Now, critique is larger than just critical theory, but critical theory picks up on this, and you can click on that link. There's a nice essay there on critical theory and what it means. But this is where the critical theorists they lament the loss of reason, and they see it as maybe a bad thing, but they want to preserve a place for reason that is useful for showing contradictions and exposing the old assumptions of the pre-Nietzschean eras. Critical theory is also part of the next, the positive nihilism, so I'll tell you a little bit more about that. In the end, they're all going to kind of come together in the contemporary, like now, movements that's happening right now. All right, post-Nietzschian positive nihilism. So there's two movements. Remember, negative, get rid of the old values. Positive, pushing out the new values. So how are the new values going to be pushed out? And I argue this at length in my book. But the new values are what is the revaluation of the old values, and they are willed out beyond the individual. Now, I don't know if this is an interesting piece of detective work. I call it detective work because I'm always drawing these crazy maps and lines between all the people. And one of the things that happened in my studies was all of these people are also socialists. And I'm trying to figure out, why are they all socialists? And it turns out the willing out beyond the individual self will result in each person against all. If it's just, I want to seek what I want. So in order to have order in society, we need to have a collective willing out. And so my theory, and I'm still working on it, I haven't written this down, I'm floating it, that the willing out beyond of the new values has to be collective if it's going to affect society. Something I'm floating. All right, and it just turns out that William James, John Dewey, Richard Rorty, Cornel West, they're all socialists. Maybe they're going to be different kinds of socialists, though, because Richard Rorty is going to say these others, James and Dewey, were a special brand of American socialism. They're non-Marxist socialists, and that's better. I'll just leave that for you to think about. But the pragmatists are going to, they talk a lot about democracy too. So the democratic ideal, maybe it comes out in trying to seek consensus for everyone in the democracy. But there's new values that are going to come out through the institutions of culture. The pragmatists are going to say, let's do what works. And what works is usually the satisfaction of desires, but it's going to have to be through the institutions. And I will talk about that again soon. Then I have cultural neo-Marxism. I hesitate to even say cultural Marxism because I did a lot of research over this in the summer, and it's just too controversial. I'll let you guys look it up and see why. So I'm saying cultural, you can Google that, or you can click on that, and then neo-Marxism. I think they do go together, and I can make a case for it. But the neo-Marxism I want to focus on is through the Frankfurt School, and these are the critical theorists too. The Frankfurt School is started in Germany under the Weimar Republic, and they're communists. But they're not National Socialists. So when the National Socialists come to power, the Frankfurt School has to flee, and they come to Columbia University, and guess who's there to welcome them? John Dewey. So the pragmatists and the neo-Marxists kind of come together. And then they later bring Derrida and Foucault over to give talks. And this is how the continental philosophers get introduced to the university in the US. The Frankfurt School, these are German philosophers who find a home in the university setting, and the university is now, at this time, the German model university. So it's kind of a conflation of a lot of things that are going on at the time. And the Frankfurt scholars are looking at what happened to Germany, where they just fled, and wondering, why didn't the Marxist revolution work out? What's wrong with these people? How did National Socialism happen? And they're having to critically analyze their Marxism. And so they see, well, there's something wrong with Marxism. So they want to fix it. They want to revive Marxism, and they combine Marx and Freud is going to say humans are driven by desire. So Marx and Freud and a bit of Nietzsche, they also bring Nietzsche to the United States, and they try to rework it. And this is now what some people are calling cultural Marxism, where instead of class struggles, there's identity politics, groups of different people who are oppressed and need to be freed. So the neo-Marxists, the Frankfurt School neo-Marxists, are interested in freeing people from their oppression. This is what they're theorizing about. I'm going to suggest that when you have and I don't even have the American Anglo tradition in here, because I argue that they're kind of 100 years behind the times. They're still catching up, and they're becoming irrelevant. And Richard Rorty is going to say, philosophy as we knew it is dead. Right now, what's happening is the what does he call them? I guess the critical theorists are doing something like philosophy as literature. The analytic philosophers are married to science, so they're doing philosophy as science. And the pragmatists are doing philosophy as politics. So philosophy as we knew it before is dead. I think this is a bad thing. He thinks it's kind of good. He's going to go towards what Wittgenstein called quietism. Maybe philosophy is like therapy, and it's something that we shouldn't discuss anymore. So, when you have these deconstruction, genealogy, pragmatism, neo-Marxism, I'm going to suggest this is what life in the cave looks like today. This is the immanent frame. And the immanent frame I'm calling institutional pragmatism, because when philosophy is I guess, nihilistic, and the philosophers are the foundation of the academy, and the academy is educating everybody else, the rest of the institutions of culture are going to be influenced by this nihilism too. So look at the political sphere right now. Is it power? Is it a power struggle? Is it anything about truth? I mean, people are saying, what about truth? But I don't know that it is. Look at the business world right now. Is it about power? Look at, I don't know if I want to even bring up the family. Look at, I don't know, how's religion doing these days? What am I missing?
I don't know, we don't talk to them.
What's the institution? I said education, business, government, family. Missing somebody. Oh, education. The academy. How's the academy looking these days? You're like, oh, I don't know, I'm in it. Today we were talking about material monism in class. Remember that earlier today? And you're like, this seems so, I don't know. I'm like, you're swimming in it. This is the view of the academy. All right, so let's do some critical reflection, some things we can ask about. And then I'll pause for your questions. Was the death of God a historical inevitability? I mean, is this the end product of Western philosophy? My friend I was arguing with also said that another philosopher, Agamben, who's a current guy, says that the end result of Western philosophy is the death camps, the Nazi death camps. I said, is it inevitable? I mean, there's like this logical force? That sounds so pre-Nietzschian to me. I think we should deconstruct that. So I would say yes, given certain assumptions of the previous era, the death of God is inevitable if you follow those assumptions. Right, Nietzsche does kind of push those assumptions to their logical conclusion. The question is, were those assumptions just like natural forces that just happened, or were they assumptions that are promoted by actors, power elites? Like, let's deconstruct that. Weren't there people pushing those assumptions, like Nietzsche and Heidegger and Derrida and Foucault? It didn't just happen. So let's learn from the deconstruction philosophers and unmask the power dynamics here. Is it true that metaphysics is dead? Oh, how sad. So we just do ethics now with no basis? It looks like that's what we do. So let's say yes, in that we don't talk about the supranatural, and we assume only the sensible. In philosophy, I mean, that's pretty much what we do. But I'm going to say that's the yes side, but the no side is no. The assumptions of only the sensible world as ultimate reality is a metaphysical assumption. So Nietzsche has metaphysical assumptions. So does Heidegger, so does Derrida, so does Foucault. They're just not being straight up about it. So I'm going to ask, can these assumptions, flux doctrine, the death of reason, anti-foundationalism, anti-objective values, can they be substantiated? Can they be substantiated by reason? Well, they've already thrown it out. Are we being straightforward about the status of metaphysics? I'm going to say we're not. Why don't we all just be honest about it and do metaphysics? Because let's be honest, it's super exciting. I say bring metaphysics back to the public sphere. And then lastly, how can we return to an honest discussion of metaphysics? I mean, that's really why we're doing this public lecture series, so we can talk about these things. So I'm going to suggest one of the ways we can return to an honest discussion of metaphysics is that we return to epistemology, re-examine our assumptions in epistemology, and let's re-examine the failure in understanding the identity, nature, and role of reason that led up to Nietzsche. And see, what did they understand by reason? Is reason the same as empiricism? Because they're using those words synonymously oftentimes. We need to do better in our understanding of reason. And I think we need to overcome our skepticism by affirming that some things are clear to reason. Like A is A. That's clear to reason. You can't get being from non-being. That's clear to reason. And if we can get some things are clear, then we can get basic things are clear. Basic things about metaphysics. Basic things about the good. Basic things about human nature and the good based on human nature. And I think we need to overcome our pragmatism, just going with what works, because what works doesn't seem to be working out there. And we need to get back to talking about the good, because the good for individuals is also the common good for the Republic. And it feels like that's something that's sorely lacking right now. And then lastly, this is my suggestion, we need to return to philosophy as the search for the logos. This is what the first philosophers were doing. This is what John's Gospel was doing, and this is what the post-Nietzschian philosophers left off. So maybe we need to pick up with that question about what is this logos and what is the connection between thinking and being. All right, I will pause here and see if you have any questions. And I guess I could move about the room. Thank you. All right, pushback. I need some pushback.
So you said that the Nietzschean philosophers were talking about bringing values.
Yes.
And taking away old values.
Mm-hmm.
When Nietzsche is sort of all about going through, or like everything is meaningless. So why would he be trying to enforce values when there is no purpose for it?
So he wants, he's worried that when you have the death of God and the devaluation of the old values, there's a vacuum. And life is meaningless. Instead of having a meaninglessness that probably is going to result in life not being worth living, he is going to endorse life. He has something called vitalism that he holds to, and it has to do with organic natural life. Like, we are part of the organic natural order, and part of our drive, notice it's not reason pushing us, it's our drives, maybe our animal instincts to live. And so the new values will promote living. That's, Heidegger had a phrase for this. He called it, shoot, I can't see it. Oh, the ideal of the superabundant life. I just figured this is the satisfaction of your desires. But imagine now you're pursuing your desires and I'm pursuing my desires, and they come into conflict. That's going to destroy a lot, right? We can't live together. There's no community. And so the new values are going to be rules that we make up in order to pursue the superabundant life in society. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. They're not ultimately meaningful. They're just meaningful in the context of us agreeing on them.
Okay.
Like perhaps something like the general will. Rousseau, a philosopher, says there's this general will. We have to have this agreement together, a social contract, so that we don't, in the pursuit of our own view of the good, end up losing our lives because someone else finds joy in hurting you or something. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. But doesn't that get into conflict with society how it is today, like with the government? Because the government creates restrictions which goes against what he's wanting us to do in finding our own good.
The government, okay, this is why I thought it was a collective willing out of the new values. The government is us, basically.
Right.
And it may be power groups against other power groups. But as long as we agree on something like, I don't know, democracy, it's us trying to convince each other of the best way to pursue the superabundant life. Like we vote, we agree we'll vote for the people we want to represent us, and they're going to represent us in such a way that they will try to get the superabundant life for the people they represent. The pursuit of happiness, maybe. But that document is grounding it in God, so that's also something that will have to be, I guess, deconstructed. Now what happens when you deconstruct the Declaration? I think anytime you have power versus power, it's going to be bad news. It's not about reason and argumentation. It's about whatever you can do to hold and maintain power.
Does Nietzsche at any point define what he means by reason?
Yes. He means what Aristotle means by reason, the laws of thought. He does.
And is he giving up reason in that sense?
No, he's giving up. Okay, so there's a distinction that Aristotle makes in the Metaphysics Book 4, where he talks about, he starts the metaphysics with the laws of thought. The laws of thought are the laws of being. So there's a distinction between the laws of thought and the laws of being. Nietzsche just breaks that and says there are these laws of thought, but they don't apply to being. Another way it was put is the law of non-contradiction is only a law for logic, or there's no isomorphism between thinking and being. That was the language of my dissertation. Okay, so if there's no isomorphism between thinking and being, the law of non-contradiction is just like a rule for logic. And then from there, he will say that these rules were made up by us. We forgot we made them up, though.
What would you say about there being square circles?
I think he's going to have to say there are no squares and there are no circles, except us imposing them. This is the anti-realism.
So if he gives up, proposes nihilism as saying you can't have ethics without justification in metaphysics, how does he propose to have a new set of values without any metaphysics?
I think it's just subjective values. Okay, he does do metaphysics. When he talks about the flux theory, the flux doctrine, that's metaphysics. And when he talks about humans as being part of the natural order and part of the flux, that's metaphysics. And then he says humans use reason to impose order on the chaos that is their experience. So this is where reason comes in. We use reason to order our experience. It's almost like we construct reality in a way. And then he's going to say the values are for supporting that natural life that we live. It's not anything transcendental. It's we're in this natural world. We have to live here. You should live as if this moment is going to be relived eternally. Live life to the fullest right now.
But even things like fullest and what is
I know.
not full assumes reason in the ordinary sense, and he's giving that up.
I know.
So he's
I think
doing
that's
what
why he broke.
many others have done. Yeah.
I know. So, I mean, you can say you give up reason, but he doesn't really give up reason. He's just, he lacks integrity, but he has more integrity than others, I would say. He tries his hardest to give up reason.
Not good enough.
That's what I'm saying. Let's revisit this, because not good enough.
I've often heard him talked about before as saying
that there's just particulars, and you can never get to universals. But it sounds like you're saying that that's not really his reason with his issue with reason.
Well, I think his issue with reason is the flux, all is flux, and that's why there's only particulars. There's no permanent anything. And that's why he's kind of a nominalist.
In that sense, wouldn't reason apply to the world?
I don't know.
Well, it would be we only have particulars, and that's because there's only particulars.
We only experience, I don't even know if he would say we experience a moment. It's almost like Buddhism. But our mind, it's not even our mind, it's our, I don't know what.
There's no mind.
No, there's no mind.
In the same way he critiques others for not going far enough,
Yeah,
in the same way, compared with Buddhism, he doesn't go far enough.
yeah, agreed. Yeah,
And Buddhism itself doesn't go far enough.
yeah. So, let's just say this has been a bad road to go down. Let's turn around and go back and do better. Because I think he is pointing out, and some of the Post-Nietzschian philosophers are pointing out bad assumptions. But I think we could do better. But we can only do better if we get beyond the baggage that we're left with. The radical empiricism, the radical materialism, the skepticism, the pragmatism. You have to get beyond that. Hang on, he's got to come back.
Would he say, if we're going to go back on this road, would he say that some things are clear? If he doesn't, there's no road to go back on.
A does not apply to the world. When you say A is A, it does not apply to the world.
But he speaks about the world.
Yeah. Thank you. He gets the thumbs down. Luke and then Nathan.
So does like the just nihilism and Nietzsche, did he just assume that not assume, but what is reason then for him? Is reason like transcendental or suprasensory because it does not apply to being?
Yeah. So he is rejecting this idea of reason as ontological, which means it applies to being, which it means it transcends the physical, which is something that like blew the minds of the first philosophers. It blew Heraclitus' mind, and Nietzsche doesn't see that. And there's another philosopher who wrote a book on Heraclitus. Her name is Eva Braun. Eva. Let's get them mixed up. Eva Braun, and she says Nietzsche has a terrible read on Heraclitus because he thinks Heraclitus is like, oh, this flux, we can't know anything. But Heraclitus actually said the logos is all around us and men are blind to it. So he is affirming some things are clear. The logos is all around us and men are blind to it. The logos is the order, the ratio in the world, the laws of being, and our thinking fits that. And he was like amazed by this. Nathan, you had a question?
Yeah, so it's just natural for me to wonder, when the more I learn about Nietzsche, what was taking place a little beforehand in Germany, right? So you have the Protestant Reformation, and they challenged the Catholic Church and kind of break this idea of you can only know God or talk to God through me, or you can't even possess the Word except for through us, right? So they challenged that. In the next couple of hundred years, a man comes along and says, God is dead, or something like that, and I'm here to proclaim that it's knowable, that nothing is knowable.
Yeah.
How is this not challenged? Well, what is the church? What's happening with the church right now?
I hear you. Professor Tussing, is this going to be connected to the talk you give in the spring at all?
It could be.
Oh.
Could be, because I heard Professor Tussing give a talk on this. And I'll be honest with you, 2 summers ago, no, it was 1 summer ago, 500-year anniversary of the Reformation.
Yeah.
Since I was doing Nietzsche, they said, hey, can you connect, the Reformation to Nietzsche and fill in the blanks? It was a challenge, but I would say it's probably the fideism in the church that and certain views of the will that leads to Nietzsche. But I'm going to be honest, I'm still reading my German philosophy history and putting the pieces together. But I saw when Professor Tussing gave his talk that at the time of the modern period, there are a lot of challenges in the world. There are political challenges, there are philosophical challenges, and educational challenges that the church wasn't able to answer. And because they weren't there to answer, in terms of moral questions, the philosophers, secular philosophers, stepped in. And so the modern period in philosophy are pretty much secular answers to the questions that prior to that the church should have been answering.
Right, so in that couple hundred years, so, I mean, how did this happen? I mean, I guess, so like the idea of your religion is supposed to be something that's personal now?
Yeah, so German pietism is one of the answers.
Okay.
That, if we want, we can talk about Luther. He has this view called the two kingdoms,
Right.
where there's this world, and maybe Christians shouldn't be involved in politics in this world. It's not their duty, at least. And then there's,
So the
die
church
and go to
is,
heaven and get the reward there. When you split those, this world and the next, then this world is going to be ruled by somebody. And so maybe you can point to Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms and pietism, German pietism, where you're focusing on your relationship with God and your personal life, and it becomes maybe sentimental and dead. Eventually
so
it's
just
dead.
succumbing to the idea that you can't make public declarations, speaking about your position in public, eventually leads
Well,
to
that
this.
comes after the wars of religion. After these wars of religion, 100 years pretty much, the philosophers are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We're fighting over doctrine. Doctrine's what divides. Why don't we keep doctrine out of the public discussion? And John Locke writes the Letter of Toleration, where he suggests keep religion private. In the public sphere, we appeal to reason and the moral law. And then the reason and the moral law are whittled away.
Yeah.
So what do we talk about now?
So it feels like the academy is doing the same thing, right? You
Well-
can't really know stuff, but we'll let you know stuff. You're really not capable of knowing anything, but through us you can know some stuff. Everything is a social construct. Well, where do those come from? From us. So this is what's happening in philosophy, right?
Well, okay.
It's something that's personal
so
now,
maybe
you can't-
what happens is the failure of the church, and they become socially irrelevant, and the academy steps up, and the church has gone into fideism. You can't know, but you just got to believe anyway. And the academy goes into skepticism. You can't really know. So now we have skepticism and fideism, and nobody can really know for sure, and here we are. Power struggles. So the church, that's why I said in my other talk at PBCC, this is just one side of it, talking about the academy. The other side is the church. And really that's maybe more important, because if religious people want to influence the world at all, they're going to need to get their act together first. No one's going to listen to a divided church. 41,000 different denominations. Why should we listen to you? You can't even agree amongst yourselves. So, Luke?
Back to my kind of just real quick. I still wanted to, how does Nietzsche discern what is because since there's no metaphysics, or metaphysics is dead, and so is the supernatural and that, then how does he discern what is real, what is reality?
He does it. Okay.
If there is no
this
reason.
This is a good question.
How does he do anything with no reason?
Eventually he becomes silent. But what happens is the philosophers before him, remember, they're moderate materialists. So all that exists is matter. He pushes it to a radical materialism. All is matter, but this matter isn't fixed and knowable. It's changing always. Why does he do that? I think he probably has already rejected God. Incidentally, Nietzsche's father was a Lutheran pastor who got sick and died while he was young, and Nietzsche's really mad about this. He's like, my father worshipped you, God, and you didn't save him. If there wasn't a holier person than him, I don't know, how we could even believe in you. So Nietzsche's rejected God. What do you put in its place? You got this moderate materialism. He's going to say that's not good enough because it's still kind of connected to some of the ideas of the past. So he pushes it to its logical conclusion. But then when he lives it, he kind of breaks himself. He breaks reason, and then he breaks himself trying to live consistently with it. Because if reason doesn't apply to being, then there really is no meaning, and you really can't know anything. And how do you live that way? So the last 10 years of his life, he was crazy, and he was unable to do any productive work. He was silent. He didn't do anything else.
What is his stance on like a soul? How does?
So old school. There's no soul.
I mean, the how are we all matter? Because the argument against all is matter.
You're right. You're hitting. He doesn't argue for this position. And that's the really frustrating part with a lot of philosophers. They just take the position and you're like, yeah, but what? And there's no argument for it. So this is my beef with all of these philosophers. And I keep telling people this book is my coming to terms with my education. This is what I've been taught for the past 25 years. And I paid a lot of money for it. And I'm kind of mad about it. Like, I paid money for this. Why didn't I learn about Plato and Aristotle? I had to go do that on my own. And they're offering an alternative. Why? Why didn't I learn about this? I mean, I learned about, remember this class? The language, something about linguistics and Aristotle and Plato or something? Dr. Anderson, remember this one? So we learned about linguistics all around. Language games, this, and we didn't go into Plato in depth. Like I literally did not study Plato until 5 years ago. In depth, like reading all the dialogues, reading the secondary literature, trying to understand it and make sense of it. So, Professor Luger.
I only paid for 2 hours. I think we should stay here until around 3 o'clock in the morning.
No, lady, I go to bed early.
You have covered so much that it's hard to tell where to begin, but I have a few just comments.
Okay.
So we agree that the death of God phrase is a metaphor.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it's a metaphor for losing belief.
Yes.
And what is the status of those beliefs associated with losing the belief in a God? And that is that there is an external authority that all our understanding and knowledge would be scrutinized relative to.
Right.
Whatever doesn't fit is wrong, and whatever fits is right. The question, of course, is about that authority itself is now up for grabs.
It's a vacuum. Yeah.
It's because it is also part of our beliefs.
Right.
So I think that the problem that we have here is that you are searching is there any way to go back to the authority that provided by the belief in God or associated system of beliefs without falling prey to all of this critique of that picture.
Right. I would actually just be happy if we could go back to the authority of reason or establish the authority of reason that maybe never was established. I'd be happy with that.
Right, but now if you start to talk about reason, so you could take the phrase death of God to death of reason,
yes.
death of morals, death
Yeah.
of norms, death of, and
Yeah.
so forth and so on, because they are all belong to the same class of things.
Right.
You would say, I tell you what reason is, this. And somebody says, well, you know what, I disagree with you, do me something. In other words, what these people were struggling with is how can we actually get to that authority, but not just merely because we agree. Because we agree on many things. An agreement has its own reason and logic.
I hear you.
How do we get? How can we do that?
This is what I suggest in the book. When Aristotle wrote his Metaphysics and was talking about the laws of thought, he addressed Nietzsche. He addressed Nietzsche way before Nietzsche came along. I think he missed that part. But he said, if you divorce reason from being, you lose all significant speech. You aren't saying anything about anything anymore. And he has this very nice argument by, it's almost a reductio ad absurdum, like what happens when you give up reason as applied to being. And it's the loss of significant speech. And he talks about subjects have predicates. If you don't have a subject, if you don't have being, then you have predicates of predicates of predicates ad infinitum. Derrida affirms this and says, yeah, that's what play is about. That's what the language game is about. But there's no thing about which we're speaking. And so if there's no thing, words don't have any meaning. If words don't have any meaning, what are we doing right now? This is just diddling. So I would say that's where we can say reason is the authority. If you say reason is a tool that we all have access to, but that tool also applies to being, then our thinking can apply to being, and we can start there. So we can come to an agreement about what A is. So that's where I start. A is A.
Yeah, so I understand the sort of intuition that sort of Aristotelian intuition that you know, reason in some sense has to almost by its very nature in some way get attached to, by being you mean objects.
What exists?
What exists?
Existence.
Yeah. Right. But somebody can argue that that is just another metaphysics.
Okay, then I'll pull an Aristotle and say, did you say something that means something right now?
Yeah, right. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
That's how he does it. He says,
yeah, right.
If they say something, then they're affirming something, and there we are, we're using reason again. So come, let's reason together.
Right. No, I see the point, but the point is, what if somebody says, you know, that's just another interpretation, you know, that
Say, all right, let's test the interpretations by means of reason.
And so we go.
I would say it's inescapable.
No, I agree. Look, you and I agree. I just wanted to say how far these people can go.
I know, I said bring it.
And the second point that I want to make is about your use of metaphysics and the use of natural and sensory. The natural and the sensory need not be the same.
True.
You can have a lot of natural or a lot of things in the natural world that are not accessible to our senses.
True.
And so I think that a lot of the people that, for example, were doing philosophy of science, and there was the big debate, which was a metaphysical debate, whether, for example, there are theoretical entities.
About whether there's what?
Theoretical entities.
Okay.
Whether
Yes.
those sort of terms.
Yeah, today we were watching a video in Philosophy 101 about Hilbert's Hotel and the Infinite Hotel. But we were trying to think about, what are these numbers? The numbers are infinite, and there's like the natural numbers and the rational numbers, and what are these? So yeah, I think that's something that I wonder how let's say a radical materialist is going to account for. I'm not even sure the materialist can account for numbers.
I think that materialism, so pure materialism, will have a lot of problems with numbers and stuff like that. I'm not just saying, I'm not promoting materialism. I'm just saying that there's a distinction between what is the part of nature.
I totally agree with you.
And what is sensory.
The natural world came from Nietzsche in his vitalism.
Right.
So his radical materialism is that all of matter is in a state of flux. We are part of that world, and this is where he kind of shifts to the natural world insofar as we are an aspect of nature. Mm-hmm. And that's where the vitalism comes in, where we as natural beings want to live, and that's where the superabundant life comes in.
Right.
So they kind of get conflated, but you're right, they're not exactly the same thing.
And they're not the same, but even if you had everything in flux, that doesn't mean that there are no laws of flux, the way things always change.
What are laws, though?
And finally, I want to say something about metaphysics. So people, for example, that were arguing in the area that you call post-Nietzsche, let's say the logical positivists and the pragmatists.
Yeah, those logical positivists I'm going to put over here.
Yeah.
They're still moderate.
Or analytic philosophers.
Yeah. How about the latter, analytic guys?
So they were, for example,
Quine.
asking a lot of metaphysical questions about the natural world.
Right.
So I worry a little bit about conflating metaphysics with transcendental metaphysics.
Okay, but what do we do with this claim that we're post-metaphysics? A lot of them make that claim. We're post-metaphysics. I think what they mean is we're post-transcendence. We're only in the material world, but they don't want to say that's metaphysics now, because now they're open to the same critique that they're doing to the non-materialist. I was just saying, let's equal the playing field and call it what it is. We're all doing metaphysics. Every single one of us is doing metaphysics.
I agree.
And it's fun, so let's do it.
I agree that we are all doing metaphysics. I think some of the people that talk about post-metaphysics, I think what they have in mind is the idea that philosophy is about constructing a big metaphysical picture and then sort of throwing it out there without saying, for example, how do we get to know these things? How do we justify these things and so forth? So I think that's what they mean by post-metaphysics. But it could be that some of these people also push it too far and then identify it with materialism, which is itself a metaphysical view.
Yeah.
And I want to, last point I want to make is there is a middle ground. And the middle ground, I think, it can be extracted from Popper's fallibilism.
Okay. I have read a little bit of Popper, not enough to be able to respond.
Well, his basic idea is, in science, he first proposed it in science, he thought of science as proposing theories and doing a lot of effort, putting a lot of effort into falsifying them.
Yeah.
And we never say that they are completely true.
Okay.
But by trying to falsify them, we make advances.
You're right. So let's, in my book, I try to argue that there is something we call weak justification, which is like what you're talking about, science, where we get to high probability of truth, but we don't get to certainty. But Socrates was looking for something stronger than that to have knowledge of non-scientific things, like philosophical claims, like what is real, can we know if this soul exists, what is the good life, can we have knowledge of what justice is? So these are philosophical claims that can't be justified with the scientific method. So some people are just going to say, well, then let's get rid of them, rather than saying, no, let's get a method for knowing those things.
But that's what I mean, the middle ground.
Yeah.
You demand certainty about these things.
Only for like 5 things, not for everything.
Right, but for morals and metaphysics and
Sure,
all
why
that.
not?
And those people say, well, if you can't have that, then just throw it all out. There may be a middle ground which says that maybe we can't get at any point in time certainty, but maybe we can advance our understanding of things by making proposals and trying to see whether they work.
Can we be certain that being cannot come from non-being?
That being cannot come from non-being?
Yeah.
Well, what comes to mind is what Mike Vallée argued.
But I don't know what
Well,
you're...
if there is nothing, then nothing prevents from something coming into being.
But what are the properties of nothing?
Well, you have to say the properties of nothing is that there is no space, there is no time.
No existence, no
matter.
properties, no power to give rise to something. So if you have that, which isn't anything, can't give rise to anything.
Why not?
Because it's...
Maybe certain things can pop out of into existence out of nothing.
Well, then maybe everything can pop into existence.
Yes, maybe.
Well, there we go. We're into radical skepticism again.
No.
Yes. Because we can't really know if this just happened. What?
No,
Game over.
it doesn't follow from that.
It does, though.
No, it doesn't follow because you ask, is it possible for something to come out of nothing?
Metaphysically possible? I'm
Yeah.
not saying logically possible yet. First, is it metaphysically possible?
Okay, then you have to tell me what constraints metaphysical possibility puts on
The
and
nature
discourse.
of being. I mean, if you say being is something that exists, it has properties, like maybe it's matter, or maybe it's spirit, and it has the power to be. Like, this thing is going to continue into the next moment. Non-being is the opposite. No existence, no properties, no power. And since it has no power to give rise to something that does have power. It's not possible. Unless
Not
you want
possible.
to reify it and say non-being is being.
Here's
A is not A.
Here's the problem. When you say, is it possible, then the possibility is relativized to something, either logical possibility or metaphysical
Well, I'm going to
possibility.
say it's neither. It's not possible logically because if you say being can come from non-being, then you're making non-being into being. And you're saying A comes from non-A. That's logically possible. And then being, metaphysically, you can't get something from nothing. So both of those doesn't work.
I would argue that it's logically possible because there is a way of describing that. So it doesn't.
Conceive of it.
Oh, that's very difficult. I agree. But I do not equate conceivability with possibility. Certainly not logical possibility. There may be
Can anyone conceive of it?
for all I know, I don't know. If by conceiving you mean, is there anyone in the world that can go through a process in their mind such that they...
I guess I just want to know, what does this process even look like? I can't, it's a contradiction. How do I hold a contradiction in my mind? at the
Oh,
same time?
yeah, that's the issue, is whether it's a contradiction.
All right.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, another point, many people these days talk about collectivism.
Yes.
I'd like to know what that is.
I just go with the general will.
Okay.
The general will is as far as I can.
General will is good enough for me.
Good enough? Okay. Any others? All right. Oh, Paul.
My question is if Nietzsche believes in the last man, doesn't he?
Yes, I think so.
The man, the man, and
Yeah.
how does, if he thinks those are going to be the last people existing, but he also believes that the man will come to a higher existence without God. How can that be? Because the last man is all about men who don't seek
Okay.
the true happiness.
All right. That's a really great question. Where do you hear about the last man? Totally forgot about the last man.
I showed him a documentary about Nietzsche today.
Cool. All right. So I think you're on to a problem in Nietzsche that it's kind of incoherent, right? How can you go from, having these, morals that are going to guide your life, you get rid of those, and now you have human versus human, and what we say is good, and I don't know if we ever really come up with something better. How are we going to become better humans? Is that your question?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think we are. I think we're not. It's more like just a power struggle. It's like, who wants to be a winner of the arm wrestling match?
Yeah.
Now it's like a cosmic arm wrestling match. I don't know. Maybe I'll think about it some more. Ben?
Your talk kind of reminded me of this book Charles Taylor wrote about Haeckel. And in the introduction, he kind of connects back German philosophy as starting with The Sorrows of Young Werther. This it's a story about a young man who commits suicide because he's so depressed about, I think his girlfriend, he wanted to marry her, but she wouldn't marry him because he's from the wrong class, and so he commits suicide, and then supposedly a whole bunch of Germans committed suicide.
Okay, I kind of remember this story, yeah.
And that Hegel was trying to kind of reconcile this need for a subjective, for truth to somehow correspond to your subjective desires with the objective, and then Hegel kind of worked that out. Your talk kind of, it sounds like Hegel or Nietzsche's maybe doing something similar, where he's taking this whole subjective thing just to a totally new level, where it's all subjective.
Yeah, I think so. He's definitely going to reject Hegel. He's responding to Hegel, he's rejecting that, because I think Hegel still has this necessity, reason working itself out in history. But I think you're right. It's called perspectivalism, Nietzsche's view, that I guess everything is based on our perspective. And since each person has their perspective, they're radically different. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I was
radical subjectivity is perspectivalism.
The book of his that I know the best is Beyond Good and Evil.
Mm-hmm.
And I always get really confused in it, because it sounds like he's saying truth is different for each person, and you just kind of make your own truth.
He's kind of taking a perspective like the sophists in terms of truth. It's pragmatism, basically. Truth is subjective, and basically the outcome is pragmatism.
But if someone says God exists, they're just wrong, right? It's not that it's true for them or something?
Yeah, they're just wrong. Yeah, they're just they're behind the times. They could use some education. Okay. Call it good for now? Now, remember, the conversation continues next week at PVCC. Oh, I think this is...
I don't think we can bring
it
up
up. Next week at PVCC, Professor Anderson's talking about why do we need the humanities, and then 2 weeks from now, in the daytime at GCC, we have the God and Truth panel discussion, and I'm canceling classes, so if you're on my Tuesday, Thursday, you come to that one, right? Extra credit. Does anyone need to take a picture for the co-curriculars? So I'll stick around. Okay. Otherwise, thank you for coming. Go talk metaphysics with your friends. Stir it up a bit. Do metaphysics. It's way fun. All right.